Hello, Google Cloud Security community. It is really great to see so many of you online today. It makes me really excited to know you are all here to learn about how to better use our SecOps tools and understand the ins and outs of data pipeline management in Bindplane. Thank you all for joining us today. Really sincerely, thank you. Before we start, I want to give a huge sincere thank you to all of you that not are only on this webinar, but those listening to the recording later, and to every single one of you in community that's actively engaged today. We have come a long way since we first launched, and it's because of your dedication, your vulnerability, your patience, and your willingness to connect, to network, to share, to help for the greater good of solving each other's problems and sharing your experiences and understanding of how you use our tools. So a huge round of applause and thank you to all of you that are part of this amazing journey. Let's continue to build great things together. I am and we are committed to your success. So let that inspire all of us and continue fighting the good fight, helping to protect against the bad guys. We have a few items of business I'd like to address just real quick. Thank you all that submitted your questions. We plan on covering them today during this webinar. And then also this webinar specifically covering Google security operations tools. If you have additional questions on the topics we covered today that we did not answer, please feel free to post on the page that we promoted this webinar. We will get to them as quickly as possible. Also, this will be recorded and we'll be hosting it in community after today's presentation. This is my first webinar for community, and to avoid any technical difficulties, we decided not to include chat this time. So thank you for your patience. We will get that added to our next webinar. Appreciate you all understanding. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick things off. I'd like to introduce to you Greg Kushmerek from Google and Craig Lee from Bindplane. Greg and Craig, thank you all for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you guys.
And thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today representing Google and the community. Some of you might have seen me post in the past, so now you can put a face to the name. I am very happy to be joined here today by Craig Lee, Principal Partner Engineer at Bindplane. He's going to help out with the hard questions that I certainly can't answer. He's also going to help us by doing a nice little demo later on. But yes, we want to give you a nice little perspective on how this works and how you can use it. And to that end, our agenda is we're going to first talk a bit about installation. And I have to say, like, this is, 1 hour webinar. There's only so much you can do in the time. So this is meant to give you a broad view. We're not going to get into nitty-gritty details on installation, but more like, what does the landscape look like? We're going to then cover some use cases, get into that demonstration, talk about some resources, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We did receive some Q&A questions in advance. We're prepared to answer those. And if we have time for others, of course, I'll leave it to Matt, since we don't have a chat, how we'd actually handle anything else. But he's got eagle eyes. I'm sure he's watching what's happening in the community. Just for perspective, wanted to start with a little quote here from Ali Mellon and Forrester. The benefits of a purpose-built data pipeline tool are to reduce the data preparation necessary to interpret the streams of data and events to specific to security insights. And this is a step forward for what is SecOps. Now, I started here when it was Chronicle. It had been Backstory, became Chronicle. There was no case management. And back then it was very simple. You get data in, and that's that. And if you wanted to do anything else with it, there weren't a lot of options. The forwarder had some options for regular expression matching, but it wasn't designed to start to filter things out, for example. And also the general idea behind Chronicle was, we price it in such a way that you shouldn't have to worry about the way data goes into the system. So if all data just goes in, then you have less of an opportunity to actually miss a security incident. And I still generally believe in that, right? Like, we believe at Chronicle or Google SecOps, you should be sending all of your DHCP logs in, so we can help make that affiliation between what is the machine that's reporting something that has a 10 dot address and what machine was assigned that 10 dot address, right? You have to have those logs. But the flip side, of course, is that when you start sending in a ton of data and you've paid for a certain block of it, you may very well know that there are things that you don't need, or you have other requirements to manipulate the data. The market has told us repeatedly that they need this, and we have introduced it. So let's talk about how you get rolling. The first thing I want to point out, and thank you to Bindplane for providing a number of slides for today's presentation, including this one here. Just if you take a 50,000 foot view, right? The goal, of course, is to get data into Google SecOps, like I mentioned. Then the question, of course, is how does it get there? Now, this is looking at places where you would have a collector. This is excluding anything that would include a cloud-to-cloud type of resource, like an SQS feed, a pub sub feed, right? Choose Firehose, right? Choose your feed type from cloud to cloud. Here we're talking about especially on-prem. It could be anywhere you can deploy a collector, though. And in that case, you have effectively two broad things that you could be talking about installing. One would be the collectors themselves, the agents that would sit on a machine like a domain controller, for example. So you see that there's either OpenTelemetry collectors or Bindplane collectors that you could have on a machine. You'll notice that in this diagram, there's either the OTel or the Bindplane going to a Bindplane gateway. That could today also be a Google SecOps forwarder, but our goal, like we've been partnering with Bindplane, our goal is to drop the forwarder. I think this year we're going to, I have to be careful, don't quote me for sure on that, but our goal is definitely to replace the forwarder with the collector. And I believe that this year, that by the end of this year, that will happen. In any case, you can either be sending them to a collector that acts as a forwarder, to the forwarder itself these days, or you could have these reporting directly to SecOps. So that's one nature of what I need to install. And of course, those need to be managed. And today, when you get the collector from GitHub, for example, you have a YAML file that you need to configure. And YAML files are as much fun as going to the dentist, in my opinion. And one of the ways we can help get around that is that, well, there's this Bindplane capability that you can host pretty much anywhere. So there is a self-hosting capability. You could download the server and you could just stand it up on name your server. There are other options inside Google Cloud, and Bindplane themselves, they also have a managed option, right? So either way, right, this is an excellent way to configure your endpoints that you want to have as collectors, to reconfigure them, to deploy processors, right? But it's a much better way to manage what collectors you have than just having to custom do YAML files inside, Notepad++, VI, name your editor. If you want to get an agent installed and you have SecOps, and if you have SecOps, I imagine that's one of the reasons why you're on this call. But if you go into SecOps, there is a collection agents under settings, and you'll notice that there's either installation files. That is a link to the GitHub repository that's controlled by Bindplane. You also have the installation authentication file that you need to have that secure connection. Just remember that by default, Google as a platform supports TLS 1.3 by default. So that would be your default authentication when you're doing these connections. And of course, there's also a configuration file, which you can use to start to create your YAML file. And as I mentioned, writing YAML files isn't necessarily the best way to go. And we do have an option for you. And one of them is that you can leverage the Bindplane Management Console. And one option, of course, as I mentioned, there's the bring your own server, literally meaning you can stand it up anywhere that you have an IP address that can talk to your collection agents. To be honest with you, when I first started fooling around with this, I deployed a server in my own private cloud instance, and it didn't have connectivity to anything, but I still went in there, set it the way I wanted to, generated a YAML file and downloaded the YAML file because it was still better than editing the YAML file. But I did one version in the editor, then I needed to make changes. I'm done with editing the file. So that's actually, the poor man's version if you really just want to get started. There is, of course, the Bindplane SaaS, as I mentioned. And if you're a GCP customer, which, again, you probably are if you're here, if you have rights to do this in the cloud, and I recognize that not everybody on this call has necessarily the rights, but this link here, Console Cloud, Google.com, the marketplace, there's this product, Blue, Medora, Bindplane Enterprise Solution. that will bring you to this page where in your project, you could stand up a server, and it tells you it's going to stand up a VM that has, certain resources that are being consumed. And then you have to go through the whole process of how are you going to control its access to the outside world, right? If it's standing inside Google Cloud, you have a VPC-SE connection or some kind of NATed connection. How are you getting out to the world? How do you connect to your collectors? But you take care of all of that connectivity magic, and then you can deploy your collectors from Bindplane, control their configuration, and update them as well. But either way, that functionality exists no matter how you deploy the Bindplane console, right? The Bindplane SaaS, on-prem, whatever. The Bindplane team themselves, they have created an integration page that you can use that talks an awful lot more about how all of this works for you as a customer. So there's the different additions, features, use cases that are supported. You see it's bindplane.com/Google. So this is a great place to go just for general information about this. And I should note, there has been a very significant investment in this partnership. It's not only are we Google Cloud Security using the OTel collector with Google SecOps, and as I mentioned, to the point where we intend to get rid of the forwarder. I know that there is a co-equal process with the cloud logging team to use OTel as well, so that Bindplane's functionality is optimized for cloud logging capabilities too. And if you're in that use case where you are considering sending operational data into cloud logging, for example, you could have one stream, and we'll talk more about this, but you have the confidence that it's configured to be able to work with cloud logging. And I believe that some of the use cases that are on this page will discuss this further as well. Now, a couple of things that are worth noting, and I took this directly from our documentation. So it is quite literally the copy paste it looks like. There really are two Bindplane editions that are the Google edition. One, of course, Bindplane Google edition, right? You'll notice it says all Google SecOps customers get Bindplane at no additional charge. That's 100% true. And you can route your data only to Google, right? Whether it's Google SecOps or cloud logging, right? BigQuery, cloud storage, right? So that's where that partnership starts to come in. And then there is a basic filtering with regular expressions capability available, right? So there's something there. There's no redaction capability. You have some transformation capabilities. There are limits. And then you can also use it as a gateway, right? It's there in the fine print about how it's available for you to set up. How does that differ with the Bindplane Enterprise Edition? If you are an Enterprise Plus customer of SecOps, you'll notice that not only can you send it to Google, the telemetry that comes out, but you also, for 12 months, have the ability to route it to one additional source. The use case this is especially meant to help address is enterprises that are doing a migration from SIM A to Google SecOps. And whatever that SIM is, most people don't flip a switch, turn off their existing SIM, and just turn on Google SecOps and go over. Generally, people like to have data going to both for some period of time so they can make that transition, doing their testing, all the rest, and then switch with confidence. And that's what this is meant to help provide in that case. After 12 months, if you wanted to do it further, it would not be for free. There is also advanced filtering processors that are available to you. So and some of this we'll talk about in a little bit more when Craig comes on to talk about, how these use cases work. But you can filter by condition. There's field severity that you can use for what you want to filter in terms of filtering what you drop, right? There's also data reduction capabilities and duplication capabilities. You also have PI masking. And I've been on a number of calls. I mean, I've been I started when it was Chronicle. I've been here about 4 years now. And when I started, and for a long time afterwards, anytime somebody said, I have data source X, it has sensitive PIA data in the logs, I need that to be screened or masked when it goes into SecOps, or at the time Chronicle. The answer was has always been, you have to do your masking before it goes into SecOps. And to that end, this is what Bindplane will let you do, is that you have that ability to define what those terms are, and you can automatically redact it as part of the stream. And you see, you also have the ability to delete your fields, delete empty values, right? Do coalescence for transformation. So a lot more transformation capabilities. I've talked to customers about the need for this. Like they helped me understand, like, because again, my position had always been like, well, if we make it available to you, right, at a point where you can just ingest, right, we're an exabyte based platform, you need to send petabytes, go for it. But people are like, well, why do I need to send this log when I know that some percentage of it is literally something I don't have any interest in? It doesn't have a security use case. It's excess. There's stuff that I want in here. There's stuff that why should I pay for it? And so that is really why we've come up with this answer, because I know people who have been using commercial products to help screen, and they said that they have, with their other SIMs, they've been able to recoup their costs from what they've been able to exclude, right? So you pay X for a commercial product, you recoup your costs by what you exclude by not going in. Therefore, right, it's been a win for them. When this became abundantly clear, this is why we've entered with this partnership and have this functionality. Now, the collection agent itself has the ability to, as I mentioned, send logs to multiple destinations. So, as I was said earlier, you can send it to Google SecOps, you can send it to cloud logging, but you can also send it to other sources, right? So earlier I mentioned it could be BQ, it could be cloud logging, it could be PubSub. But of course, it could go to a completely different SIM. And that is a powerful feature, especially when you also have the ability to throw in the processing capability for what you want to do further to the data. So you could be putting on labels when it goes to stream A versus stream B, which makes it easier for you to know where it is and how it's being controlled. And you can make measurements off of it, for example. And you can have multiple processors in the stream so that you're able to do further work on it, right? And the flexibility, I've certainly played with it. The flexibility is really, really good for you in this case about how far you can go, how you manage the logs, how you can identify content. You can have multiple processors on data. There's a lot of flexibility built into this. So if we move over into some of the use cases, there are really 4 broad use cases, right? You can route your data, as we've been talking, sending it to different destinations, but you can also filter your data to control the volume and scale, redacting your data for sensitive data, or transforming it as you're preparing it for downstream use. And along those last 3, right, you see like, hey, when I want to filter something, ingesting every log, right, and the metrics, they're costly. I don't need all that data. I only want to ingest the logs I need. And I want to route the rest to a low-cost storage for archival and compliance. And that is a key point, right? A lot of people, so SecOps doesn't have a cold storage capability. Everything's hot. And then it's like, well, all right, there are just some things that all I need is to just archive it. And you always play that line, right? Some people say they want cold storage and then they want to re-ingest something later on if it becomes useful. I personally don't advise that. Because you lose out on the enrichment capabilities. So you have to figure out where that line is. Where do I ingest something versus where do I throw it into cold storage? But if you know that the only reason you'd ever want to have it there is because you have to show a compliance officer that you have the data, and otherwise you don't intend to be searching through it to help identify attack X, right? Potential problem Y. Then at that point, it does make sense to say, all right, let's just throw it into cheap storage somewhere, whether it's, a GCS bucket or whatnot. As well with transformation, you can, you can have your system with a non-standard log structure. And as anyone who spent time on this, the minute you start talking custom and a Google SecOps feed, you're probably in trouble because, right, we're close to like 1,000 parsers now, but the one basic assumption that we put in every one of our parsers is that you're working with the data as is expected from the original supplier. So if you take a log from a supplier and you strip out a field, I've talked to customers who have very strong needs. Like they'll use their own DPM services internally to take logs from different places, and they'll add tags on things, and they'll strip other fields out and maybe change formats, and then they'll send this to a wide variety of consumers internally. And then when you try to take that massively changed stream and send it over into SecOps, it typically doesn't parse. It's almost guaranteed to break at that point. And then you're in the what next category. One option, of course, is you could build a custom parser. When you build a custom parser, you're responsible for maintaining the custom parser. All right. Maybe you can achieve what you want by using an extension. If you're not familiar with extensions, extensions work at the database level, meaning that the data comes in from the stream, the parser has worked on it, and then an extension can do something further. Now, if the data isn't parsing in the first place, that's a problem. The extension isn't going to solve it for you. On the other hand, if the data's come in and there's just been something minor and it managed to make it so that, two fields aren't parsing properly, you could probably fix that with an extension. But you're still responsible for maintaining the extension. It's still better to send us something as close to raw or raw as original, the original format. And in that case, if you can untransform something, remove the addition, or just, transform it somewhere else and just send the stream straight over to us, you're in a better position. But either way, you have that flexibility. And of course, then there's redaction, right? As I mentioned before, somebody has PII, for example, and they want to anonymize the PII data. In that case, right, it makes an awful lot of sense to grab something in stream and get rid of the details. In terms of enriching security logs, something you can use the Bindplane processor for, we have to be really careful when we use the term enrichment with SecOps, right? Just to take a step back, enrichment can mean a few different things to a few different people. One is when the data comes into SecOps, we take, for example, there's a holy trinity of what you pull in. If you pull in your network logs, your identity logs, and your EDR logs, right, we're able to take these three things and do a lot of cross references so that we see that this IP address on this EDR was associated, as I mentioned before, with this 10 dot address assignment from DHCP, and the firewall log saw that go out. We can trace all that and have better movement. And if your user ID maps to something and your email address is what's being reported, then the enrichment can associate your email address with your user ID. That's all enrichment that happens in the logs. We're not talking about that here, right? We're talking about here is that you have a wide diversity of sources coming in from different places, and you want to add on labels and namespaces so that you can better sort them. And that can be very helpful for even things like writing rules or performing searches, running statistics. And so that's 100% available so that you can say that this is the source. We have people talking about federation use cases, right? They have different departments. They all have their different 10 dot networks, but they all use the same, nomenclature. So they want to then say, well, this came from that department, that department, that department. Make sure that you have a label and associate appropriately as it's coming out. This is what it's very useful for. There are, of course, also this idea about sending data to multiple Google destinations. You can send the raw logs to SecOps for SIM, and you can send parsed logs if you have something that's doing parsing for you to Google Cloud Logging, right, or to Google Cloud Security. I'll notice that if you're sending parse logs to Google Cloud Security, one interpretation of that would be it's something that you've parsed in advance, meaning you've probably written as UDM. That's always been available to you. What's not happening, of course, is that we're not using Google parsers in the streams to normalize the data to UDM. So you'd have to be doing that on your own. There is, of course, one other option that's not on here is that you could be sending logs to Google Cloud Logging and to Google Cloud Storage. Right. So if you think about that, cloud logging gives you search capabilities. Yes, right. It's not parsed per se. You don't have quite the same scale capabilities, search and scale like you would with SecOps, but your OpEx logs are going in there fine. Meanwhile, then there's the other logs where just for compliance purposes, you have to collect them. You don't care so much about being able to find them. You can always throw them into BQ Omni later on and just figure it out. But otherwise, they just sit on disk. Right? You just want the cheapest option possible. Cloud storage is perfect for that. And then there's silent host monitoring. This is something that has been a steady drumbeat of a request for years. If I have an individual machine that is no longer reporting in logs, how do I know it's gone quiet? And the Bindplane system has a way to do this, and that's something that's coming up a little bit more in the how it's done. Right? You effectively identify that host with a processor, and so you are labeling the sources as they come in, and then now that they're coming in, you have Google Cloud logging capabilities where you're leveraging this technology inside of GCP to create an alerting policy. That's the general view of it. But this answers a question that we have been getting time and time again, that I have one customer, they literally have tens of thousands of Windows domain controllers. If a couple of them go offline, if one goes offline, how do you know, right? Just being able to monitor the stream of data and knowing that something's reporting in less data, that may not be statistically significant. You can't be tracing every one of those down. So now we have a definitive way of talking about, a certain log is not coming in. This host has just gone dark. And then, of course, data reduction, right? This is an enterprise edition feature here. So SecOps works on the raw body, and you can be looking at the stream saying that, well, before that raw data comes in, what is it that we want to exclude? And one, of course, is you can do it based on attributes. You've set up a severity attribute, right? You've done something to say that based on the nature of this log and where it comes from, I just don't want to put it in on this stream. Another way, of course, is that you can be looking inside the stream itself. Like I have Windows events coming in, and I have a particularly chatty domain controller that I'm pulling it off of, and there's just a whole series of other events. I can't turn it off on Windows events, but I certainly don't want to pay for it on the backside. So I'm just going to say, grab this matching string and any logs for that, completely excluded from coming in. Also good for creating data sampling. Sampling is a dangerous place, right? If you take the position of how do you know something is a problem if you're not recording it, then saying like, well, I'll take a statistically significant sample instead to reduce costs, you get into this territory of like, well, what is significant? What is the risk that I'll still miss something? So I'm not going to tell you that you should just automatically drop ingest everything, but you could determine like, hey, I'm pulling in flow logs, I'm pulling in Zeek logs, and those logs are very noisy. And at that point, all right, fine. Sampling probably makes more sense. Then you just figure out like what's the volume, what's statistically significant. We'll drop X number of logs so that we just don't have to pay for the ingestion on that. Okay, I can see that. And of course, with deduplication as well, it is possible that you're going to see the same thing happen repetitively. You could be looking for certain patterns there and remove that too. And finally, of course, masking, right? Again, this is an enterprise-only feature, but you can take PII data and you can then identify that and have it come out. You see that, on the bottom right-hand side, there's an example here where we're just identifying a string and saying, we're just going to take that and change it into something else, like all stars, for example. So once it's in forever until it rolls off, right? If you have tenants by default have a 1-year retention, and you can't delete logs. So if you really want to make sure that the data isn't visible and data RBAC isn't going to be a solution for you, this is your best bet. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Craig.
Thank you, Greg. So happy to walk through a little bit about Bindplane. We're going to build a configuration together and then dive into some use cases specifically. So bear with me one second while I go ahead and share my screen. Move that over. Okay, great. Looks like you can see my Bindplane instance. So when you first log into Bindplane, this is what you normally see. It's overview, it's in the visualized view. And what we see are many different configurations. And we're actually going to build a configuration together here. But effectively what it is, it's what you're collecting. So the different log sources, the processing configuration, and where you're sending that data to and the destinations. Those configurations are associated with many different agents. So I have a few, as you can see, noted here. And then sending data on to things like my SecOps destination or Google Cloud for Google Cloud logging. Where I recommend everybody start their day is in the overview summary tab, and you can see the total amount of agents connected. And what these agents are, these are the managed OpenTelemetry collectors. So today that is a Bindplane distribution of the OpenTelemetry collector. We're using the open source op-amp protocol to then connect back to Bindplane, whether it be something you host within your own environment or like I'm demoing out of here, this is our SaaS-based environment. And then from there, you have command and control functions. You can look at the status of the collectors and push down configurations and updates and a few more things it'll show off. But we can see that we have 8 that are connected here. I'll mention that this is my kind of small demo environment. We have actually tested Bindplane for a single cluster to have over 500,000 collectors connected, and we are looking to scale up to a million as well. So we can do this at a broader scale. These are all interactive. So for example, I can click on outdated, and then these are all of my outdated collectors. I can click on this to select them all and also upgrade those agents. So I have that option here. So jump back over to summary view. The other thing that I find really interesting is this data summary graph. So for example, I'm looking at logs. Let me zoom this out for the last 30 days. And for my destination, so sending the logs over to SecOps, the total amount of agents and configurations sending data to SecOps, we have about 20 gig in. And because of the filtering we're doing, I'll show this off in a second, we're getting about a 36% reduction. So this is data that is not making it over to SecOps. It's being filtered directly at the source. So diving into further and how this is actually done, we're going to look at the Agents tab. So this is a list of all of my agents. I'm going to go ahead and install an agent. Clicking here. And I have several different platforms which are supported. The reason why we call this out, one, to actually build the configuration for the proper package, and then two, also tie those configurations that make sense. So for example, Windows events to Windows operating systems. We can do that here. So from here, I'll pick Linux, and I actually have 2 different agent types. I recommend for, at least for now, stick with 1.0. It's what is stable. With version 2.0, we're actually opening things up where folks can bring their own OpenTelemetry collectors. And there's even things in the roadmap for Google building a distribution, for example, of the OpenTelemetry collector. That is the work that 2.0 is going to be able to support. We have that in beta today. So we'll go with 1.0 for now. We'll hit next. And what this gives us is a single line installer where it will reach out to our GitHub repo, pull down the installation script, and then there's 2 interesting pieces of data. One is this op-amp connection back to your Bindplane server. In our case, it happens to be our SaaS instance, and the secret key. And why I'm highlighting this is what we see when folks roll this out at scale. They use things like Ansible, Puppet, Chef, System Center Configuration Manager to perhaps pull down the packages from our GitHub directly. Maybe they want to do their own security scans and then roll them out at scale, using whatever configuration manager that folks are using within the enterprise. And then with those 2 pieces of data, the secret key and then that URL for the op-amp connection, they can then update this manager.yaml file. It's very easy to do. Once that collector is restarted, it will then be available within Bindplane for you to manage. So you can do this at scale. I wanted to highlight that piece. And now we have agents that are installed on several different systems that we can then build configurations for. So I'll go ahead and go to create configuration. And for this one, we're going to start easy. We're going to go to SecOps, Windows, and I will pick Windows as the platform. Then next, then go to add source. So sources are the metrics, logs, and trace sources that we have integrated within Bindplane. These are pulled from upstream. These are metrics, logs, or trace receivers that are part of the Bindplane project, and we've even developed some of these jointly with Google. And from here, we have what we call intelligent default. So often it's just a couple mouse clicks, and it's everything you need to do to collect the type of telemetry that you're looking for. In this case, I'm going to go ahead with Windows events, and we're going to go with system application security. So again, good with the defaults. In the case of us sending data over to SecOps, we want everything to be parsed within the platform itself, and we'll dive into that here in a bit. So we want to send raw logs, and we'll highlight we do support custom channels. So very common type of architecture for sending data to SecOps is to have many different Windows systems send to one Windows system using Windows event forwarding, and then we can then pull off of those custom channels. So common scenario for us, we could support that. And then purpose of the demo, I'm going to go ahead and start at beginning just so we front load a lot of Windows events and can make things interesting for the demo. So I'll go ahead and hit save here, and then next, and then add destination. Here you'll see a list of all of our supported destinations. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight a few that we have for Google. So we're going to build one for SecOps. We do support sending to the forwarder, and that's to help people transition as they're rolling things out. But ultimately, with the OpenTelemetry collectors and the gateway functionality, that's what I would recommend people start with today. We can also send data. Recently, we just added this for Google Cloud Storage. So we can send to both SecOps and Google Cloud Storage from within that same agent, that same pipeline configuration. And that is great for compliance reasons. Or perhaps there's an IT operations type of use case where you want to send things to Google Cloud Observability Suite. And that's why you would use this destination in parallel with SecOps. For the demo, though, I'm going to send things over to SecOps. I have some configurations that I have set up ahead of time using the 2 different APIs available. I'm going to go ahead and click on one of these. And I want to note that all the different configuration destinations you can save also for the processors and sources, and you can save those within our library. You can reuse these over and over again. So perhaps you have a SecOps destination set up with a secret key. You can save that in the library to be reused for all of your configs. So I'll go ahead and hit save. And now we have a basic configuration. Oh, failed to create config. Interesting. Okay, we'll go ahead and add agents. I'm going to roll this configuration out to some agents. Click here and apply. And so now the configuration is saved. And I'll go ahead and hit start rollout. And so what that will do is we'll make a connection to my collectors over that op-amp protocol. So these are being managed. It will then push down the configuration and restart the collectors with the new configuration applied. We also keep track of the different versions of the configuration. So in this case, this is on configuration version 1. And what's pretty interesting here, Greg was mentioning about the config YAML file. So that's what is actually being constructed here. You can view that at any time if you click on view config file. And this is that configuration pipeline, which is being created and then pushed down to those OpenTelemetry collectors. You can look at that for reference. So I have 3 different Windows systems running this config. They're collecting raw Windows events and sending over to SecOps. And I'll go ahead and click next on this process review. So these are processor configuration tiles. There are 2 of them. When you click on this one, this is everything that goes to SecOps will go through this processor configuration. Let me zoom out so you can see this here. So this is a great sandbox view. It's great to play around with the different processors. And what we do is we make one sampling call out to one of these agents. So either A, B, or C, all of them are sending data. And what these Windows events look like, and this is actually a raw event, where we have things from the OpenTelemetry collector, for example, like time or observed time, things like severity, and then the actual body. So again, this is raw, and this is something that SecOps can do parsing on. So right out of the gate, we're getting 2 different recommendations because we're sending data over to SecOps. So the first one is add log type and ingestion labels to SecOps telemetry. So this is alluding to that use case that Greg talked about earlier. I'll hit view, and now we have the recommendation here. So I'll add a log type, and this is WinEVT log. So this is specifying the parser that is going to be used on the SecOps side, and we actually tag that data. So if you're interested in what is supported, you can click on supported log types, and then this pulls up the full list of log types and default parsers. And in this case, WinEVT log is what we're going to be sending data to. So from here, the namespace, that's all configurable, but perhaps you want to do something like namespace WinAppTeam. For the ingestion labels, I recommend adding these for context, great key value pairs to add a lot of data for sorting later. So things like application name, data center, perhaps the customer name, and then hit accept. And then let me move this over a little bit. You can see on the right-hand side, after that processor has done its thing, what is being added as far as attributes. So here we have the Chronicle ingestion label for the app team, Chronicle log type, namespace, all this being set here. So what I would recommend, best practice for any pipeline you're building for SecOps, make sure to use the standardization processor. And the other thing I would recommend, and we're adding this now as a smart default, is add batch processor to SecOps telemetry. And what this will do is it will batch the various logs as they are being sent over to Google. So we're sending these over in these payload batches. So how many messages get batched together. And this is great. The defaults will allow us to scale even for high throughput type of Windows systems, just as a example. And then it's as easy as that. I will go ahead and save. And now this is in draft mode. So I can see the changes within the processor view, but it's not been rolled out to the agents. I hit start rollout. And then it makes that connection over the op-amp protocol, pushes the configurations down, and then restarts the OpenTelemetry collectors. So now I'm sending this data over to SecOps, and this is a basic configuration for sending Windows. So great. So now let's go a little bit further. So this is, again, basic configuration. Now we want to go to, I'll show some more advanced use cases. I'm going to jump over to another config that I have here. So this is on Linux, and this is a little more elaborate. So I'm gathering using TCP raw, some syslog firewall logs, things from like Linux Audit D. I have a flat file from my application server. And you may notice that this looks a little bit different than the other screen. This is actually our version 2 routing, which is available to everybody. If you click on the gear, you can upgrade your config to version 2. And we're doing something interesting. For example, we're sending the audit logs right over to Google Cloud Logging. So we can add that in as part of our routing functionality. For the data I'm sending over to SecOps, you'll see a reduction of 52.7%, and that's based on the 4 processors that I have here. So it's giving you that direct feedback on the type of filtering and how effective it is. So I click on the processor configuration. You can see there's a little bit more going on here. I have 107 logs that are coming in, and we're filtering based on severity. So we're filtering out the debug logs and things like warning, and then you can see what is being passed on here. So fatal error and whatnot is being sent over. When I open this up, you can see similar to what I built with the other configuration, we're adding some attributes in. But one unique thing we're doing is if you look and see that there's this Linux app A for this ingestion source. So what this is I have a copy field process configuration, processor config, where I am taking the host name. So this is actually added by default for all OpenTelemetry collectors. I am saying that the log source is Linux app A, it's from the host name, and then I'm sending it to this attributes field of Chronicle ingestion label ingestion source. And by the way, everything I'm showing you here, we have a how-to in our docs on how to do it. So you don't have to take notes on the name. And what this allow us to do is identify the source of the logs, so Linux app A. We are then sending that to this ingestion label for ingestion source. And then the interesting thing here, when I go over to my incidents, this is that silent host alerting, that use case that Greg showed off earlier, how we can actually go from the Linux log source to identify it, and then ultimately go to Google Cloud Operations here and to have the alert. So when I click on the incident summary, I could see that for a time that I had my VM turned off, and I turned this off at night, just wanted to save money in my demo environment, the ingestion source Linux app C was down. So it's giving me alerts here. In the real world, like Greg had mentioned, folks may have hundreds of systems, Windows systems, Linux systems at scale. I've seen it all. By copying that host name, or perhaps things like a computer name, and we can also perhaps also extract that via regex or things like syslog. We can identify that and then add that as the ingestion source label. So all this can happen automatically within your pipeline at scale. What the actual alert configuration looks like, so I'll zoom out and go to the policy name here. I'm going to go to edit, and I am alerting based on Chronicle collector, ingestion, total ingested log count, and then I have a trigger here. So when this metric for any of these hosts that it knows about is not being sent for over 5 minutes, to fire the alert. So simple silent host monitoring type of configuration, but you could definitely take these methods and then scale them up as we're going. So final thing I'll mention here, masking sensitive data, very easy to configure. And one other point, this has a lot of things out of the box as far as defaults, but that is configurable. And I've seen folks, especially within like the banking world, put in a custom rule for regex for like folks' account names, just as an example, and to be able to filter those out. So definitely flexible. But I'll go ahead and stop there because I think my demo is at time. But if you have any other questions about use cases, two things I would encourage you: go ahead and sign up for Bindplane SaaS. It's totally free for every Google customer. You can build your own sandbox from within that environment. Or if you have anything specific, please reach out and we'll be happy to go further.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was a great demo. Fun fact, back when I was doing DLP work, I remember we had regexes at a bank looking for credit card numbers, and it frequently caught FedEx tracking numbers. So you can always have fun with your regexes. All right. We're just about done here. I want to mention a couple of resources that are available to you. There is Google Cloud Community, right? Presumably, if you're in this session today, you've heard about it through the community, but if not, it is a great resource. I mean, so kudos off to the cloud community team, right? Matt, Erica, this has been a growing enterprise. It is something where I'm watching customers ask real issues and having them addressed. There's a lot of work to get people from Google Cloud Security to come in and answering things. It's not an SLO, but if there's not an answer, people are being encouraged to look and get an answer. And the crew definitely does invest to do what it can to help there. We also welcome your feedback, right? goo.gle, GCC event feedback. Please let us know the first one of these webinars, and if your comment is never let Greg present at one of these again, I can take it, right? But please do provide your feedback. And of course, we have other events coming up. You'll see that if you're in Melbourne, right, and I'm presuming that that's in Australia, not Florida, we're going to have an event on June 19th. Same thing with Sydney. I happen to be in Cambridge, so I suppose I should show up for the June 27th event in Boston. And then you see July 3rd, Fishing for Gold, Cyber Threats. So we've got a lot of fun things on the calendar. And to that, it is time for some questions. We do have some that came in advance. First one, I'm going to lob over to Craig. What are the best practices for managing a large amount of data in Bindplane?
Excellent question. So there's kind of two different aspects I'm going to answer on. One, on the architecture side, is to use gateways. So what gateways are? They are OpenTelemetry collectors that you can then forward multiple OpenTelemetry collectors telemetry streams into. You can aggregate at those, similar to like the Chronicle forwarder. When you have a large amount of data, put a load balancer in front of it, and then you can run those gateways within a HA mode. So that can be highly available, and you can really help to scale. So that's kind of one way I've seen it. Also, with those kind of configurations, folks will send very high throughput syslog streams at something like that. So you have a load balancer in front of kind of larger systems, and then the processing is done at the gateway level. So that is one way to handle it. The other way too, to manage large amount of data within Bindplane, you saw within the configurations where you can say, like, for this config, here's what the amount of throughput is for a certain log type. So you can really get granular here, where perhaps you can have a configuration for a certain type of application, and then you then know how much is being sent from that type of application, where you can then do things like deduplication or filtering.
Great, thank you, Craig. Next one, actually, I'm going to send your way as well. Are there any plans for a data process function for work with sources like IP info?
Yeah, excellent question. So today we have what's called a lookup processor, and then so with that, and it's most simple type of configuration would be powered by a CSV. So something would come in within the log stream, perhaps like a username. You could then look up perhaps the detailed version of that username or the IP address range, and you can change that. We do have capability to back that via Redis. I believe that is coming in a roadmap. But as far as using IP info and reaching out, that's something where if the folks who are requesting could reach out to me, we'd be happy to look at that as far as a roadmap item.
Thanks, Greg. The next question is, please talk more about custom dashboards in Google SecOps and create a demo with string and numeric functions if possible. I would personally love to do that right now because I geek out in doing that kind of stuff, and I've got a bunch of great examples for it, but it's not really appropriate for this session, so we're going to have to delay that for another session. We could probably also post something internally on the community page. Then there's what is Google Chronicle's strategy to monitor silent log sources? You've seen the first part of that, right? There is an answer here. When you use Bindplane, you now actually have this ability to do so. And I will note that there's a second part to that question that isn't being answered. What about cloud-to-cloud sources? What about that thing you said with Firehose, Kinesis, S3, GCS? What about those? The fact of the matter is that we don't have that answer today. I spoke to the product manager who owns that. He has a very strongly defined product management roadmap to do that. I can't say more because I'm not authorized to, but we're very well aware of the ask, and we are very much working on a solution for that. We do want to provide for that. There was a second part to that question. Assuming you have with regards to silent log monitoring, assuming you have obsolete operating systems like Sun Solaris or AIX, that one I'd rather push back to Craig.
Sure, I can answer that. So we've actually dealt with this with customers, particularly in the financial space. A lot of AIX still running there, where for the older operating systems, I would have them forward syslog to a collector that is running on a modern Linux distribution, and Solaris can also support syslog. So that is another way to do that. Perhaps both of those instances could also write their custom logging out to like an NFS mount, and again, read that in via a Linux. So that's how I would suggest that from an architecture perspective. For a modern version of AIX, we actually have a version of the OpenTelemetry collector that will be available to run on AIX. So we have a distribution that's underneath development right now, a package for AIX, and then we are working to get that sent to the upstream.
Great, thank you, Craig. Another one here is, what are the best practices for ingesting unstructured logs and developing custom parsers for these? This is a tricky question. Let's just assume for a moment that when we talk about unstructured logs, we're talking about any raw log, and we're getting beyond any question about what you'd want to filter, right? Mask, any rest of that. It's like, all right, I have a log source and I don't have a parser for it. What now? I'll point out that it is Google's policy that if you are taking a log source from a commercially available product, there's probably some parameters around here, but it has to have it. Like you have a legitimate business reason to pull it inside of SecOps. Google will develop the parser. That we do. This is why we have dedicated teams of people to do it. When I first arrived here, that definitely wasn't the policy, but no, we do that now. Now, on the other hand, right? What if you have something like my favorite example is I wrote a Java app, or somebody, Todd, before he retired 5 years ago, right? Wrote 25 years ago a Java app that sits on a server in the closet. It does this one thing. Right, we can't turn it off. We don't want to turn it off. We want to get the data in, but it's like it's completely unknown to anything else. How do I parse that? All right. There are things that we're doing inside of Google for these types of use cases. If you have structured JSON, there is now an automatic UDM mapping capability that comes in. So you have a key value pair inside JSON, and the data comes in. It will be automatically put into extracted fields, UDM fields. They're not indexed. But we're also then working on ways that you could manage that so that you could identify something to be indexed. You could, of course, write an extension that will take something and then remap it to a known field. There is a page inside of our documentation about important fields for UDM mapping, which if you need to write your own parser, we tell you these are the fields that are really optimized. These hit curated detections. These are ones that we index off of, right? These handle enrichment. These go into the entity graph. Knowing those is very important. You could always do a minimalist approach where you say, I'm going to take, like, this is clearly IP. This is clearly, username. This is clearly host name, right? I'm going to take these things. I'm going to map them to known, like principal.ip and, whatever, right? Those known fields. The rest of them could just go straight to extracted fields, and you could just work with that. You can write rules on them. You can do searches on them. It works. But then, like, what if I have something that just like it's just way out there and it doesn't really map to anything? You could always write a parser that's going to get to some of the things, or you could just leave it to extracted fields if it's not key valued pair structured JSON. Today, you would have to do something like writing your own parser. We do have documentation for that. Partners are always available to help with that as well. There are a variety of resources. This as a topic is something that could be gone on to much deeper, so I'm staying at a high level, especially mindful of time. There was I believe one last question here, which actually was there. Sorry, I'm just looking at the list. Or was that the last one?
I think that was the last one, Greg.
Oh, actually, I think no. Is there a way to leverage the deduplication features in Bindplane to optimize, decrease your Google SecOps ingestion rates? Although I think we kind of covered that today a bit. So go back. I believe that Craig gave you a couple of good examples for that. If any of these answers gave you a taste, but doesn't give you enough information, please go to the community pages and post there. And I'm sure that we can do more to get your answers there and share it with others. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone for their time today. I appreciate especially Craig for all the help. And I will hand this back over to Matt Nichols for any last words.
Thank you, Greg and Craig. Really appreciate your expertise and walking us through data pipeline management and Bindplane. Thank you so much. Thank you to all that joined. Hopefully you got all the answers you needed for your questions and to get you through these new cool features. If you have additional questions, please go and ask them in the post for this webinar or post in the SecOps Sim, SecOps Store forums, and we'll get some answers to you. Thank you everyone for your time and joining us today. We look forward to having you on the next webinar. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Erica. Everyone have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening. Cheers, and we'll see you soon.